It all started when Octavia met Oscar at Creekside College. She was focused on her art, and he was working toward a business degree. They clicked instantly, and from that moment on, they were inseparable. After graduation, they didn't waste time. They got married and settled into what looked like a perfect life. Octavia got a job as an art teacher, and she loved it. Her students adored her, and she poured her heart into her work. Oscar, on the other hand, quickly climbed the corporate ladder at a local investment firm, thanks to his charm and family connections. He was ambitious and determined to succeed. They became well known in their community, the kind of couple people talked about in a good way. Their house, bought with Oscar's growing wealth, was a reflection of their success. Everything seemed perfect from the outside. But things weren't so smooth behind closed doors. For years, they tried to have a baby, but it never happened. This struggle started to drive a wedge between them. Oscar buried himself in his work, spending more and more time at the office, while Octavia found comfort in her art and her students. They were growing apart, even if no one else could see it. The cracks in their perfect life were getting bigger. Octavia and Oscar's relationship seemed flawless to everyone around them. They met by chance, two young students from different worlds, and their connection was immediate. Octavia, with her passion for art and creativity, stood out to Oscar right away. Oscar, confident and driven, had a way of drawing people in, and Octavia was no exception. They shared dreams, ideas, and soon enough, their lives. From their early days at Creekside College, their bond grew stronger. While Octavia immersed herself in her art, Oscar was focused on building his future in business. He was always thinking ahead, setting goals, and Octavia loved how sure of himself he was. They balanced each other out perfectly. Her calm, creative side softened his ambitious and sometimes intense personality. Their love story unfolded quickly. After graduation, they decided to get married, eager to start building their life together. They moved back to their hometown, where they planned to make a name for themselves, and from the outside, it seemed like everything was falling into place. But beneath the surface, there were things neither of them could have predicted. Their story was just beginning, and not in the way they expected. As time passed, Octavia and Oscar settled into their routines. Octavia's life revolved around her students and her art. She would often stay late after school, helping students with their projects or working on her own creations. Her love for art was not just a job, it was her way of expressing herself, and it gave her a sense of fulfillment. Oscar, meanwhile, continued to push forward in his career. He was always attending meetings, working on deals, or planning his next move. His ambition never seemed to waver, and with each promotion, his time at home grew shorter. They were both thriving in their separate worlds, but those worlds weren't as connected as they once were. They became the couple everyone admired: successful, good-looking, and living in a beautiful home. On the outside, they had everything people strive for, but with Oscar working long hours and Octavia finding solace in her art, their marriage started to feel more like two parallel lives. They were together, but the closeness they once had was slipping away without either of them really noticing. To everyone around them, Octavia and Oscar were the perfect couple. They were well known in their community, always attending local events, charity functions, and town meetings. People admired how polished they looked and how effortlessly they seemed to balance their busy lives. Whether it was a gala or a casual gathering, they were always present, always together, and always the topic of admiration. Their home in Oakwood Estates became a symbol of success. With its carefully designed rooms showcasing Octavia's artistic touch, it was a place where they hosted parties and gatherings that people talked about long after they ended. Oscar's wealth allowed them to live comfortably, and Octavia's eye for detail made their house feel like a work of art. The Fairweathers were more than just a couple, they were seen as a team. They represented ambition, talent, and a seemingly perfect life that others aspired to have. Friends and neighbors often talked about how they still had that spark, how they made everything seem so easy. But what no one saw was the growing distance between them, hidden behind the smiles and small talk at every event. While everyone admired their public image, the reality of their marriage was slowly unraveling. Behind the perfect image, things weren't as smooth as they seemed. Octavia and Oscar had been trying to have a child for years, but it wasn't happening. Each failed attempt took its toll, especially on Octavia. The stress of fertility treatments and the constant hope followed by disappointment weighed heavily on her. It was a silent pain, one they didn't talk about much, even with each other. For Oscar, the frustration led him deeper into his work. He was already spending long hours at the office, but now it became his escape. The more time he spent away, the more distant they grew. They still loved each other, but the connection they once had was fading, replaced by unspoken tension. Octavia, on the other hand, found comfort in her art. She poured her emotions into her work and focused more on her students. But no matter how busy she kept herself, the emptiness at home lingered. They were living separate lives under the same roof, both avoiding the growing cracks in their marriage. What had once been effortless was now full of strain, but neither of them knew how to fix it. During these difficult times, Octavia leaned more on her mother, Cordelia. Cordelia had always been a free spirit, someone who lived life on her own terms. She had traveled the world as a photojournalist before settling down in Creekside after meeting Octavia's father. After his death, she embraced a quieter life, spending her time tending to her garden and volunteering at the local animal shelter. For Octavia, her mother's home was a place of peace. Whenever she felt overwhelmed by her struggles with Oscar or the pressures of trying to conceive, she would visit Cordelia. They would spend hours talking over tea, and Octavia found comfort in her mother's presence. Cordelia's calm and understanding nature provided a safe space for Octavia to express her frustrations and sadness. Oscar, though distant from Octavia, had always been polite with Cordelia. At first, he appreciated the support she gave his wife, but as the cracks in his marriage grew deeper, Cordelia became more than just Octavia's comfort. Without either of them realizing it, Oscar started to feel drawn to Cordelia in ways that would soon push everything over the edge. What started as innocent conversations between Oscar and Cordelia slowly became something more. At first, it was just polite small talk during family dinners, but soon they found themselves spending more time together. When Octavia was busy with her students or lost in her art, Oscar would occasionally visit Cordelia on his own. At first, it seemed harmless, just a son-in-law checking in on his mother-in-law. But those visits started to feel different. Cordelia, with her relaxed nature and worldly experience, was easy to talk to. She listened to Oscar's frustrations about his job, the long hours, and the strain his marriage was under. She never judged him or pushed him for answers. Instead, she offered a listening ear, and Oscar began to open up in ways he hadn't with Octavia for a long time. There was a warmth in their conversations that Oscar found comforting. Over time, he looked forward to his visits to Cordelia's cottage, where they would share a glass of wine and talk for hours. It wasn't long before they both realized that what was developing between them was no longer just friendship. Without intending to, they had crossed a line that neither of them could undo. It all changed one autumn evening. Octavia was completely focused on preparing for an upcoming art exhibition, leaving Oscar feeling more ignored than ever. That night, he decided to visit Cordelia's cottage alone, something that had started to feel more like a habit than a simple visit. He told himself he was just checking in on her, but deep down, there was something else drawing him there. When Oscar arrived, Cordelia welcomed him with a warm smile and a glass of her homemade wine. As they sat together in her cozy, cluttered living room, the conversation flowed easily, as it always did. But that evening, something shifted. The atmosphere felt more intimate, the silences between their words carrying a weight neither of them had noticed before. As Oscar opened up about the growing distance in his marriage, Cordelia listened with the same empathy she always had, but now there was something different in her eyes. Maybe it was the wine, or perhaps it was the loneliness they both felt in their own ways. But before they knew it, a line was crossed. A touch that lingered too long, a look that held more meaning than it should have. That night, they both knew things had changed. What had started as a simple conversation had transformed into something neither of them could take back. After that first night, there was no going back. What began as stolen glances and brief touches turned into something much deeper. Oscar and Cordelia found reasons to see each other more often. She suddenly needed help with things around her cottage, and Oscar was always available to lend a hand. He'd show up under the pretense of fixing something or offering advice, but both of them knew it was just an excuse. Their secret meetings became more frequent and more daring. They carefully planned their encounters, making sure no one suspected a thing. Oscar would tell Octavia he had late meetings at work, and Cordelia would create reasons to avoid family gatherings. Each time they met, the tension between them grew, turning into a mix of desire and guilt. The affair wasn't just physical, it was emotional. They shared more than just moments of passion. Oscar confided in Cordelia about his frustrations with life and his marriage, while Cordelia opened up about her own loneliness since her husband's death. They convinced themselves that what they had was special, something neither of them could get anywhere else. The thrill of the affair consumed them, but they were blind to the consequences that were about to unfold. As the affair continued, Oscar's behavior at home started to change. Octavia, sensitive as ever, began to notice small things that didn't sit right. He seemed more distracted, often lost in thought, and he started spending more time away from home, claiming work was busier than usual. His phone would buzz at odd hours, and he'd step out of the room to answer, always with vague explanations. Octavia's instincts told her something was off, but she couldn't quite put her finger on it. At first, she tried to brush it off, telling herself it was just the stress of work or the pressure from their ongoing struggles to start a family. But the more she observed, the harder it became to ignore the signs. A faint scent of unfamiliar perfume on Oscar's clothes, a lipstick mark on a coffee cup from his office that wasn't hers, small things that began to add up. She didn't want to believe what her gut was telling her. After all, they had been through so much together. But as the changes in Oscar's behavior became more noticeable, Octavia couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. It wasn't long before her suspicions began to focus not just on Oscar but on someone much closer than she ever imagined. The moment Octavia had been dreading finally came on a quiet Saturday afternoon. She had spent the morning at school, finalizing details for the student art exhibition. Oscar had left the house early, muttering something about playing golf with clients. As Octavia drove home, her mind kept circling back to the uneasy feelings she had been harboring for weeks. On a whim, she decided to stop by her mother's cottage for a chat, hoping that some time with Cordelia might help clear her mind. As she turned onto the familiar road, her heart stopped. Oscar's sleek black car was parked outside. Her pulse quickened, and she felt a sinking feeling in her stomach. She told herself there had to be an innocent explanation, but deep down, she knew the truth. With shaky hands, Octavia unlocked the door and quietly stepped inside. What she saw confirmed her worst fears. Oscar and Cordelia, caught in a moment of intimate embrace on the couch, completely unaware of her presence. The room fell silent as they noticed her standing there. The looks on their faces, shock, guilt, and a hint of defiance, said everything. In that instant, the life Octavia had known was shattered. The betrayal hit her like a punch to the gut, leaving her breathless and numb. She fled from the cottage, her mind racing and heart breaking, not yet knowing what the fallout of this discovery would be. After discovering the affair, Octavia was a shell of her former self. The betrayal from the two people she trusted most in the world was more than she could handle. The image of Oscar and Cordelia together replayed in her mind endlessly, and no matter what she did, she couldn't escape it. She stopped sleeping, barely ate, and spent hours pacing around the house, consumed by a mix of anger, sadness, and disbelief. At school, her colleagues and students noticed the change in her. The once vibrant and passionate teacher now seemed distant, distracted, and fragile. Her hands trembled when she held a paintbrush, and the joy she once found in her work was gone. Octavia's world had collapsed, and she didn't know how to put the pieces back together. At home, the silence between her and Oscar was unbearable. They barely spoke, and when they did, it was tense and forced. Every time she looked at him, all she could see was the betrayal. And as for Cordelia, their once close relationship was now a source of pain. Octavia felt lost, unsure of who to turn to or how to move forward. The emotional weight of the affair had pushed her to the edge, and she was slipping further and further away from the life she once knew. The day everything changed was one Octavia would never forget. She had spent hours pacing around their house, consumed by a storm of emotions: anger, hurt, betrayal. Oscar had stayed out late again the night before, and when he finally returned that evening, the tension in the air was thick. Octavia could no longer hold it in. All the pain and frustration had reached a boiling point. When Oscar walked through the door, she was waiting for him in the living room. He sensed the mood immediately, but before he could say anything, Octavia began to unleash everything she had been holding back. She demanded answers why he had betrayed her, how long it had been going on, and if he ever felt guilty about what he had done. Oscar tried to calm her down, stammering excuses and apologies, but nothing he said could stop the fury that had been building inside her. His words, full of promises to end the affair, to make things right, only made her more enraged. Without fully realizing what she was doing, Octavia stormed into his study. She knew he kept a handgun in the desk drawer, something they had bought for protection after a string of burglaries in the neighborhood. Her hand shook as she pulled it out, the weight of it heavy and cold. When she returned to the living room, Oscar's face went pale. He raised his hands, trying to reason with her, but his voice was full of panic now. He stepped toward her, and in that moment, everything happened in a blur. In the heat of the moment, Octavia's finger tightened on the trigger, and a deafening gunshot rang out. The room fell silent as the reality of what had just happened sank in. Oscar staggered backward, clutching his chest, blood seeping through his shirt. Octavia's heart pounded in her ears as she watched him collapse to the floor. The aftermath of the shooting felt like a nightmare that Octavia couldn't wake up from. As Oscar lay bleeding on the floor, she rushed to his side, desperately trying to stop the flow of blood. She dialed 911 with trembling hands, barely able to speak through the panic. The minutes stretched on endlessly as she waited for the paramedics to arrive, her mind a blur of regret, fear, and disbelief at what she had done. When the paramedics finally arrived, they worked quickly to stabilize Oscar. Octavia watched, numb and in shock, as they loaded him onto a stretcher and rushed him to the hospital. The house, once her sanctuary, now felt like a crime scene, with shattered glass and blood staining the floor. It wasn't long before the police showed up. Detective Mia Davis was in charge of the investigation, and her sharp eyes took in every detail as officers collected evidence. Octavia, still in a daze, was questioned about what had happened. Her words were halting, as if she were describing something that had happened to someone else. She explained the affair, the confrontation, and the moment the gun went off, but even as she spoke, it felt surreal. As news of the incident spread through the small town, rumors and speculation began to swirl. The Fairweathers, once seen as the perfect couple, were now at the center of a scandal. People whispered about the affair, the shooting, and the tragic unraveling of a life that had seemed so perfect from the outside. Meanwhile, Oscar fought for his life in the hospital, and Octavia faced the grim reality of what she had done. The investigation would determine what came next, but nothing could change the fact that her life had been torn apart in a single, devastating moment. The courtroom was packed the day Octavia's trial began. People from all over the town had come to witness the case that had shocked the community. The prosecution painted a harsh picture of Octavia, arguing that the shooting wasn't a crime of passion but a premeditated act of revenge. District Attorney Vincent Harding portrayed her as a woman who had carefully planned to punish both her husband and mother for their betrayal. On the other side, Octavia's defense team, led by a seasoned attorney named Morales, told a different story. They described Octavia as a victim someone pushed to her breaking point by unimaginable betrayal. Morales emphasized how the affair had shattered her world, how years of trying to hold her marriage together had taken a toll, and how the shooting was a tragic result of extreme emotional distress rather than cold calculation. Witnesses took the stand, recounting the details of Octavia and Oscar's seemingly perfect marriage, the affair with Cordelia, and the events leading up to the fateful night. The defense leaned heavily on text messages Octavia had sent to her best friend, revealing her suspicions and emotional turmoil in the weeks before the shooting. The messages painted a picture of a woman unraveling, caught between denial and painful reality. As the trial continued, the jury sat quietly, listening to both sides make their cases. The weight of the situation hung heavily in the air. Each side presented their closing arguments, the prosecution demanding justice for Oscar, and the defense pleading for understanding given the extraordinary circumstances. Finally, after days of deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. Octavia was found guilty, but not of attempted murder. Instead, they convicted her of aggravated assault, recognizing the emotional strain she had been under. The sentence was 5 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 3. As the courtroom buzzed with reactions, Octavia stood quietly, her fate sealed. The trial might have been over, but the impact of what had happened would linger for years to come. With the trial behind her, Octavia began her sentence, serving time for the crime that had forever changed her life. She was allowed parole after 3 years, but even in prison, the weight of what had happened stayed with her. The once vibrant woman who had been the heart of the community was now a shadow of herself, reflecting on the choices that led to the tragedy. Oscar survived the shooting, but his life was never the same. After his physical recovery, he left Creekside and moved to a different state, hoping to start fresh. He and Octavia divorced while she was still incarcerated, their communication limited to formal letters and the occasional phone call. While the bitterness of their shared past remained, there was a quiet understanding between them. Time, it seemed, had softened the anger, leaving only regret. Cordelia, racked with guilt, withdrew from public life entirely. She became a recluse, refusing to leave her cottage or engage with the world outside. The affair had destroyed not just her relationship with Octavia, but also her spirit. The vibrant, free-spirited woman who once filled her life with art and adventure now lived in silence, burdened by the role she had played in the collapse of the Fairweather family. As the town of Creekside moved on, the story of the Fairweather tragedy remained a cautionary tale, whispered about in quiet conversations. People would often recall how quickly things had unraveled, how a seemingly perfect life could fall apart in the blink of an eye. For Octavia, Oscar, and Cordelia, the years that followed were marked by the long, painful process of coming to terms with the choices that had led to their undoing. Though life continued, none of them would ever fully escape the shadows of what had happened.